Great, Fredo, we can go ahead and get started, I think.
Sounds good.
All right, so we'll start with some introductions.
Absolutely. Let me project my slides as well.
Great. So I'll go ahead and start, and then I'll turn it over to you. So my name is Dr. Nahreen Ahmed. I'm a pulmonary and critical care physician and a board member at MedGlobal. I'm here with my friend, colleague, and fellow board member, Dr. Alfredo Mena-Lora, who's an infectious disease specialist, and we're here to talk about COVID vaccines. Before we get started, I just want to tell you guys a little bit about MedGlobal, the organization that we work with. MedGlobal is a humanitarian NGO working to save lives and serve vulnerable communities around the world by providing healthcare services and really building resilience and empowering local physicians and healthcare providers. Our health services support refugees, displaced persons, and other marginalized communities in crisis-affected and low-resource settings. MedGlobal supports local medical providers and humanitarian partners, builds capacity through critical health training, works with local communities on critical public health responses, deploys healthcare volunteers, and donates medical equipment, medications, and supplies. In 2020 alone, MedGlobal supported over 1.3 million people and over 170 health facilities in 11 countries, including Bangladesh, Colombia, Ecuador, Gaza, Greece, Lebanon, Pakistan, Sudan, Syria, United States, and Yemen. The purpose of this webinar today is to really talk about the COVID-19 vaccines and to discuss the common questions that we've been hearing a lot of, and really to help with hesitations that people might be having, because it might surprise you to know that only 60% of Americans have said that they definitely want to get vaccinated. So we're here to help give you as much information as possible so that you can make an empowered decision for what's best for you. So now I'll turn it over to my colleague, Dr. Alfredo Mena-Lora.
Well, thank you very much. And I think I'm excited to talk to everybody about COVID-19 vaccines. It's a very important topic for your own health and for the health of society, and for us to finally turn the corner on this pandemic that has been affecting all of us. So first, I'm just going to talk a little bit about vaccines themselves and how we got here. And then I have a list of frequently asked questions that I will go through, and we're happy to take your questions as well. So kind of the first thing to discuss with regards to the vaccines is explaining a little bit about how we got them and what they do. So basically, this is a virus in the screen, and it looks like the coronavirus, but in general, any virus, any foreign type of invader will elicit the same type of immune response. This is an antibody, which is really the immune response. And what it does, this Y-form thing, is that it connects to something in the virus, and therefore it recognizes that something is foreign, and it attacks it and prevents it from causing harm. It's basically the police, the fire department in any city, and this, of course, is the intruder or the person that the police or fire are going to identify. Now, the vaccines themselves, currently we have two FDA-approved vaccines. One of them is the Moderna vaccine, and the other one is the Pfizer vaccine. We'll focus on these two since they're the ones that are currently available. But in general, most of these vaccines will do the same. They will show you something to your immune system. It's kind of like a mugshot of the virus, and then the police or your immune system will know about the person, will identify the mugshot, and once the virus comes in, it'll know that how to defend itself against it. So how does this current vaccine work? It is what's called an mRNA vaccine. And what that really means is that you're not getting the whole virus, you're not getting the virus itself. What you're getting is just one piece, the piece that matters, which is to develop immunity. So you're just getting the mugshot, and with that little piece, which is called the spike protein, it's what gives the virus this crown appearance, and hence the term coronavirus. With that little piece, you can then develop all of the antibodies. So you didn't get the virus, you didn't get infected with the virus. What you're getting is information that will elicit the response in case you do get exposed to the virus. So this mRNA vaccine basically gives information for your cells to produce the mugshot and essentially use it as a printing copy, and subsequently delivering all of this to your immune system for it to develop the protection that you need. In the future, once you're vaccinated, if you get exposed to the virus, then you already have all of these different policemen and firemen ready and kind of willing and ready to identify the virus and capture it. So that's why we get protection, because it's not something new that we have to figure out, but rather we already know about the spike protein. And with that mugshot, we're basically ready in case the intruder comes in. Now, the most important thing about vaccines is its safety. It is what we study first. In every phrase that you hear, what you will see and hear people say is safe and effective. And it actually follows that exact timeline. We first have to know if a medication is safe. And this is true for vaccines, and it's true for blood pressure medications and for antibiotics and anything else that is FDA approved. So there's all of these initial phases before it even touches a person, with animal studies and lab studies, and then eventually phase 1 and 2 with growing amounts of people that we expose to the medication and study its safety by checking every possible part of the patient or the subject, which is making sure that it doesn't affect your kidneys, your liver, etc. So it's a very intense safety phase where you really, really look into every aspect of the safety of the medication. And once we are confident that it's safe, then we do what's called a phase 3 study. Now we are looking for effectiveness. So we know it's safe. Now it's about, is it effective? Does it work? Typically, you need much more numbers to identify if something works. And here below, you see a screenshot of how we figured out that this works. Essentially, while COVID was, of course, happening in our communities, a group of folks received placebo, which is basically nothing, sugar water or something that doesn't have any effectiveness. And then they received also the vaccine. At this stage, we know that it's safe, but we don't know if it's effective. After many weeks of receiving the vaccine, an independent group of people called a data safety monitoring board, they basically take a look to see if there's a difference between those who got the vaccine and those who didn't. And this is a dramatic example of a yes, there is a dramatic difference. 95% of the people that received the vaccine did not get COVID. And that 5% of those who did not require hospitalization, did not get super sick, and did not die. So it's 100% protective for the things that we really, really care about, which is making sure you're not incapacitated or sick, etc. And pretty effective in making sure you don't get symptoms whatsoever. So really, really good news when we saw this, because what this really tells us is that the spike protein, can elicit an immune response that is protective. So with that, we have a bunch of other vaccine candidates that are being studied, and they are showing similar information to this. It is protective. So with that, I think as a baseline, here's a list of medications that are commonly asked. And with these frequently asked questions, we can then go to whatever questions you may have that are outside of what we discuss as well. So are these vaccines safe? I think with this initial kind of stepwise approach of how we got here, I want to reassure everybody that it is. One thing that I always like to mention is how many people. In these studies, we're looking at 50,000, 60,000, 70,000 people when you combine all of the different phases. And today, in February, 17? I always feel like it's still March 2020. So February 17, 2021, we're looking at millions and millions of people worldwide who have received the vaccines without safety concerns. Is it safe to get the vaccine if pregnant or breastfeeding?
I'm just going to
Go ahead.
Fredo. To
Yeah,
add to the first question, are the vaccines safe? The one other thing I do want to mention, especially as you said, so many millions of people have been vaccinated so far. And those of you that are getting vaccinated in the States, what you might notice is that you'll get a link to register for the CDC to basically inform of any adverse effects that come up. And the reason for this is so that we pick up on that safety signal as much as possible. So we want you to know that at every point when you're getting vaccinated, you have the option to register and to register any concerns that you have, any symptoms that you have. And we're getting direct feedback from people that are getting vaccinated. So we're hearing about all of the potential side effects and things like that. And as of yet, there has not been a concerning signal in the safety profile of the vaccines.
absolutely. And in fact, that just shows you that even outside of the clinical studies with all these millions of people, we are still monitoring for any potential adverse effect that is, by definition, going to be rare. And that brings me actually to this question. What about, this buzz about an allergic reaction? Well, we know that certain folks can have an allergic reaction to the vaccines. And the recommendation is to, number one, ask yourself, do you have a history of other allergies? Number two, are you allergic to any of the components of the vaccine? So you can look into that as well. And number three, based on this monitoring that we do, a study was published just last week that shows that it is, an infinite fraction of a percentage of people that have an allergy. So it is extremely unlikely, extremely rare, but more importantly, quite manageable in the sense that everybody that gets vaccinated gets monitored for 15 to 30 minutes, depending on their history of allergy, and any allergic reaction will be managed appropriately. It's so rare, so unlikely, and so manageable that in general you have to weigh that against the very real possibility of getting COVID-19 and getting really sick. So that's a little bit about the severe allergic reactions.
And let me ask you, because I know I've been hearing this question a lot, and it sort of falls in this category is, you mentioned that this is an mRNA vaccine. A lot of people are worried about their genetic profile changing, worried about DNA, things like that. Can you answer that question for us about why we should or shouldn't be worried about our genetic profile changing, any kind of problems with that?
Well, that's a great question. And the mRNA does not impact your DNA in any way. The mRNA is just a code. Basically, it is a code to produce a protein, and that protein is the spike protein. So it's not embedded in your DNA. It's just using your cell infrastructure to develop that protein without causing any disease. We get exposed to foreign proteins all the time. In meat, in food, in all sorts of different variety of ways, and that in and of itself is not an issue. The mRNA is just basically like the CD-ROM or the diskette to print out that mugshot. It's not really touching your DNA or your genetic infrastructure.
And along those lines, we have a question here that came up from Nasheen Hakim, who's asking, what are the components and the ingredients of the mRNA vaccine? And I think that's an important segue into that, because I think that's the other question that people are asking. Well, will the other things, the preservatives and the other components of the vaccine be harmful as well? Can you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, I don't have the components memorized, but it's a relatively simple vaccine. And I encourage you to look into the components to make sure you don't have any allergies to those components. It does not include egg, so I know it's not an issue with folks that have severe egg allergies, like some other vaccines are. But in general, all of these components are tested, they're safe, and in this case, the development of the spike protein also means that it's effective.
Yeah, exactly. And then some of the other components that are in there are things that you would find in your own home: sugar, basically acid stabilizers, things like that, that are often used and very commonly used things in your household, and that are extremely safe. And so because of those components, sugar, salts, acid stabilizers, things that sound complicated, but they're really not. And if you look into those ingredients, they're extremely safe. The safety profile of those preservatives is safe as well. And the reason that those ingredients exist is to really stabilize that mRNA, to protect it. So the other thing that's included in the ingredients are lipids, which is essentially just fats. Those are found everywhere, right? So things like that that are there to protect the mRNA enough so that it can do its job, and then the mRNA breaks down, as Dr. Mena-Lora mentioned. And so a lot of those ingredients are extremely safe. We've yet to see any major issues and adverse effects from them. The big one that people talk about is polyethylene glycol. PEG is also PEG, what it's referred to. That's the one it's in the questionnaire that they ask if you have an allergy to that, that's something that you should avoid the vaccine in that case. So I hope that answers that question.
Absolutely.
Okay, great. And then that probably is a great segue into what you were talking about with whether or not the vaccine is safe in pregnancy and breastfeeding, because I think, that really is a question that's come up a lot for us, right?
Absolutely. And in general, the reason why this is a common question is because not a lot of pregnant or breastfeeding females were included in the studies. However, based on the components of the vaccine, previously studied vaccines, and the overall effectiveness of the vaccine, the most important arbiter of this, which is the American College of Obstetrics and Gynecology, they are basically specialists in keeping mothers and babies safe during pregnancy and during breastfeeding. They advocate for the vaccine. In general, by now, there are many pregnant healthcare workers and pregnant frontline workers that have been included in the millions of people getting the vaccine on a daily basis. So the risks of getting COVID for you and for your baby are much higher than any potential risk with the vaccine, because we know by now that the vaccine is safe on folks, and overall there is no reasonable concern for pregnant or breastfeeding patients.
Yeah, and to add to that, working in the ICU, we have seen critically ill pregnant patients with COVID, and it is a scary thing to see. The risk of the vaccine is quite low compared to the risk of a patient who's pregnant getting critically ill with COVID. So I think that's a really important point. And the other thing to mention, because I think the fear that came up recently was when there was a statement that was released that was saying that the Moderna vaccine should not be taken by pregnant patients. The interesting thing about that is that the only reason that was mentioned, as Alfredo was talking about, was that it's just that there wasn't enough data to support that because because pregnant patients were not included in the trials. And that was the main reason that statement was made. And the adjunct to that was that you have to weigh the risk and benefit of the vaccine versus getting sick if you were pregnant. And again, being critically ill as a pregnant woman who has COVID, that's incredibly scary and really is detrimental. And so the risk of the vaccine is much lower than that particular scenario. And then the other question that I think has come up a lot that's similar, rather along the same lines, is about fertility. And similarly, most of the specialists regarding, fertility have also said that you can continue with fertility treatments without an issue, and you can get the vaccine at the same time. There's no reason to delay one or the other.
Absolutely. Other common questions are, when is my second dose, and should I miss it or should I delay it? In general, the second dose depends on your vaccine. The Moderna vaccine, the second dose is at 28 weeks. And for the Pfizer vaccine, it's at 28 days. And for the Pfizer vaccine, it's at 21 days. Is there some leeway, a day or two here and there? Yes, and the CDC has basically said, sure, maybe 1 or 2 days. But in general, what has been studied is what should be done. And, you should basically prioritize getting your vaccines at exactly the time that you should, which is 21 days or 28 days. Can you miss it? Well, there is some protection with just 1 dose, but the protection is really with 2 doses. That's what we know. That's what has been studied. There's some secondary analysis done on what the protection is with 1 dose. But in general, the CDC and most of us advocate, of course, continuing your second dose. This has been talked about because it has been talked about as a strategy to vaccinate more in certain countries like the UK. But in general, staying with your second dose and making sure you don't miss it is key things.
And along those lines, we have a question that's popped up from the audience here that's asking, do both doses have to be from the same vaccine? And the comment goes on, recent studies were published about the safety and effectiveness of mixing doses if there was a lack of supply.
Yeah, and all of this comes about, the contingency and kind of trying to figure out strategies if you do have a lack of supply. If we didn't need a second dose, then we can double our treatment or our vaccination. And similarly, if we are missing, then maybe we can switch around. These are where the questions are coming from and why it's being debated in public health circles and infectious disease circles. But the correct answer to everything is you should get the same vaccine and you should stay within the timeline. That said, switching one mRNA vaccine with another, given the fact that they work very similarly, target the same protein and everything else, is not unreasonable. It's probably better than not getting the vaccine. And that's where those conversations come from. Is it better to, let's say for some reason, all of the factories stop and we don't have any more vaccines. Is it better to get one dose than no dose? Probably. That's where, in the race to vaccinate as much people as possible in the UK, that's where that conversation came from. And if for some reason a person has zero access to one vaccine, but access to the other one, is that better than just getting one shot? Probably. But is it optimal? No.
Great. And then, along those lines, the question I think that's really important to address is, if I get my first vaccine, how safe am I after that? And after I get my second vaccine, how safe am I after that? And what precautions should I still be taking after I take the vaccine regimen?
Absolutely. And I think this graph can show you a little bit. In general, you are not completely protected in those first couple of weeks. Some analysis have shown that before your second dose, you have maybe a 50% reduction, but that 90% reduction comes with that second booster dose and with time. So ultimately, one dose is better than no dose, but two doses is really what gets you to the finish line.
Yeah, exactly. And I think the really important point I want to point out from that slide that you showed was that how that 100% effectiveness against severe or critical illness. And a lot of the complications that we're now seeing, we're about a year into this now, and many of us are seeing patients come back with consequences and complications of COVID. And I think one of the things that we're really trying to understand is, as we vaccinate people and we understand that maybe moderate to severe disease is being prevented, I think the importance of that is to recognize that that also probably prevents a lot of the major complications that cause physical and mental debility in the long term, which is really what contributes to morbidity that we are seeing with this patient population.
Absolutely.
Another question that came up that probably fits under this umbrella as well is a question that is asking, about the varying degrees of reactions, especially after the first and second vaccine. And although we know that those are expected, the body aches, the fevers, things like that, if you don't have those reactions, does that imply that you're not going to have as robust of an immune response from the vaccine?
That's a great question. And I think the key there is to understand that the vaccine can cause a reaction. Your immune system can react, and that just means that it's, doing its job in the way that it does it for you and for your body. So I, for example, had some muscle aches and felt tired. Some of my colleagues had a fever, and some of my colleagues didn't get anything. And that is true in the millions of people, but it was also true in the study. I worked on one of these studies, and some of our participants didn't have any reaction at all. And ultimately, the vaccine worked. And your reaction is, both expected, but also not necessarily something that's going to happen because different bodies have different reactions to it, the way your immune system will develop that immunity.
Great. And along those lines, a secondary question in that question stem was, is it worth it to check for antibody production? I really like this question because I think it's come up a lot and it's worth addressing for sure. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, my thoughts is that it's expected that you will have antibodies, but I don't think it's worth checking. It's not something that we necessarily do, during the studies necessarily. It's not something that's going to change anything. For example, uh, do you have antibodies because you had a previous infection? Do you have them because of the vaccine? Are your antibodies fluctuating? Is the laboratory assay that is testing your antibodies the right one? It's too complicated. And in general, the role of testing for antibodies throughout this pandemic has been equivocal. We don't recommend testing that because it has no practical implication.
Yeah, agreed. And there's some great for those of you who are looking for added information and things like that. The JAMA network does a great Q&A on a regular basis, and Dr. Paul Offit, who's also been a part of this conversation quite a bit, had also mentioned something super interesting, which I think is worth mentioning, is that antibody production and the way that we measure it is only one piece of the puzzle. Immunity is extremely complex. We often can't capture the different aspects of our immune system and immune response in just a serum test. So that's really important to know that, and that's why I think that antibody information has been so equivocal, because the complex immune response that happens is incredibly difficult to capture in a serum assay, or rather a lab test. And I think what's even more important, what is the key here, the $1 million question, or $1 million answer rather, is what happens in real life when we vaccinate everybody, right? And seeing those efficacy numbers, meaning that in the trial, we saw really robust numbers, meaning that people are protected. We're not seeing moderate to severe illness, which is great. And I think that that's a really important point to continue to see that COVID numbers are going down as more and more people are being vaccinated. Can we say that that's causation? Not really quite yet, but I think it's very hopeful to see some of those trends and to talk about that and explore that more. But I do think that's an interesting point to bring up.
The other thing that I was going to mention is, we're doing a small study looking at antibodies, and a key component of checking antibodies on healthcare workers, or in this case, post-vaccination people, is what antibody are you checking? And there are antibodies against the spike. There are antibodies against other things. So a person, most of the commercial assays are really against the nucleocapsid. There are some that do check this, but you won't necessarily know that when you go get tested. So what does it really mean? And again, it just doesn't change what you're going to do. So it's not really recommended.
Yeah, exactly. Great point. I know that there have been a few questions that have popped up about just talking through some of the common adverse effects and also some of the less common but documented adverse effects that people are seeing. And I think we talked about this a little bit. There's a range from not feeling anything after getting the vaccine, or especially what we're hearing is after the second dose, some body aches, low-grade fevers, chills, things like that. And typically, those things resolve within 24 to 48 hours, which is what we've seen. Can you speak to any other side effects that people have mentioned? I know I've seen a lot of people worried about Bell's palsy. I've seen a lot of people worried about bleeding disorders and things like that as these start to be reported. What are your thoughts on as some of those things come up?
In general, the vaccine, most of the reported adverse events in both the vaccine studies and in real life is really just kind of what we've mentioned. A person can have a fever, a person can have like a higher immune response than others, basically. Are there very extremely rare things that have been reported? Yes, and keep in mind that both in a study and in real life, what's called a phase 4. We're currently in the 4th phase of this, which is to the general population, but still monitoring it. Things can happen that may not be related to the vaccine. So for example, I may, get an illness tomorrow, and it might have happened coincidentally after the vaccine. And there's a lot of investigation to try to connect those dots. And more often than not, those dots are not, possible to connect. So there are reports of some stuff out there that, number one, is extremely rare and extremely unlikely. So for example, the allergic reaction is both, is clearly connected to the vaccine, and it's in people who have severe allergic reactions. And you've heard about those cases, and it's been documented that it's a fraction of a percentage. I mean, like 0.000 something percent of the people who get the vaccine. So if that's extremely rare and extremely connected, some of these other ones are even more rare, but it still gets reported on. And of course it gets media coverage, and people, of course, are appropriately so looking into it. But I would say they are extremely rare and extremely unlikely, and unclear if it's related to the vaccine.
Yeah, so what I'll do is I'd love for you to answer the last question that's on your slide, and then I have a few other questions that are a little bit further in our conversation, because I really want to address the hot topic of variants, and I know that that's something that people are really worried about. So we'll keep going with some of your questions as well, because I think they'll address some of the questions that are coming up from the attendees as well.
Sure. So I'll start with what if I had COVID, and then I'll move to this other slide of questions. If you've had COVID, you have what's called natural immunity. So it is your own antibodies that you have created. Throughout the pandemic, we have not seen a lot of reinfections necessarily. However, the pandemic is relatively young, and the waves of the pandemic are also relatively young. And we have started to see reinfection. And more importantly, and more difficultly, we have seen reinfection in the same person with two different genetically, different viruses. The same virus, but just we know that virus A versus virus B. We don't do genetic testing on viruses clinically necessarily. So this is hard to figure out, and it's typically done in a research setting, but it is a fact that you can get reinfected. And it is a fact that you're probably more protected within those first couple of months. But it's also a fact, going back to the vaccine, therefore, that the vaccine protection is way more robust. Your natural immunity just does not compare to the vaccine-induced immunity in its intensity and its inability to protect you, period. So that's really the key thing. So with that in mind, the general, you might see two recommendations, wait 90 days versus get vaccinated regardless. And what the CDC recommends is to vaccinate yourself as long as you're not actively currently ill. So basically 10, 14 days after your illness, you should be able to get vaccinated. We know more about the vaccine immunity than we do about natural immunity. So other questions regarding to that. So how long does the vaccine work? We're not 100% sure, but some subset analysis of how the antibodies and the overall immunity, which by the way is not just antibodies, there's cellular immunity and other things. Most of the experts in Moderna vaccine have they believe that approximately 1 year. We're not 100% sure. We can assume that it's the same for both, but it's probably anywhere between 9 to 15 months. So we may need a booster. We're not 100% sure.
And what do you suppose that means about, the question that is on everyone's mind is, what does that mean for our daily life and getting back to quote unquote normalcy?
Well, first of all, the overarching good news is that we can target the spike protein and we can get significant protection, not just almost complete protection, but at least complete protection from the things that matter, getting sick and dying. So question number one, how long does that protection, continue? And getting a booster means that you're just going to need a booster like you do for the flu shot. The second issue, which kind of points into some of these more complicated questions, is what about these variants? Remember, we developed this vaccine targeting the spike protein. This spike protein reflects the spike protein of, say, February of 2020. As more and more infections happen, as hundreds of thousands and millions of people get this condition, the virus copies itself a lot. And like any photocopy, if you make a photocopy of a photocopy, it's still the same document, but it's a little bit more blurry. So the spike protein can look a little bit different. And that can affect the ability of your antibodies from the vaccine to bind to it. So again, these mutations can render different properties to the virus. And we know that some mutations can decrease the effectiveness of the protection. So what this means is we may need a booster to modify our spike protein vaccine to reflect whatever variants are circulating. That is something that will be looked at in the future. But also, in the meantime, we don't know if you can give COVID-19 despite being protected. So remember, if we go back to this slide, these are people that come back and say, my throat hurts, or I have, breathing problems or whatnot, and they get tested. But are there people in this group that have COVID and just don't get any symptoms? That's a possibility. And in a world where everybody is vaccinated, that doesn't matter. But we are not in that world. So there is a possibility of giving COVID-19 to somebody, theoretical possibility. And for that reason, we have to still use a mask in order to contain our own saliva and not give it to other people. But also for the protection of receiving potential variants from other people. That impacts our ability to travel, that impacts all of these things. So there is still risk. There isn't a silver bullet yet. I think we have to make infections lower and kind of go down dramatically so we can impact these variants. And in the meantime, getting a vaccine means you're way more protected than otherwise. But we still have to navigate the pandemic and hopefully get to normalcy.
Yeah, and I think the point to also make here is that, the thing about variants is this was a known and expected process to happen with this virus, because many viruses do this. They change because their priority is to survive, if you think of it as in that way. And the thing is we only know when there is a variant if we test for that. So presumably, as we continue to vaccinate, we will start to see whether or not there is a true signal with the fact that a vaccine may not cover a variant. To date, knowing what we know about it, the strain that's in the UK, and knowing after sequencing it that it's quite similar to the original strain that left Wuhan and traveled across Europe to the US, that the thought is that the vaccine is still protective of that. There's a lot of discussion about other strains that are very worrisome, ones that are popping up in Brazil and South Africa that people are worried about. That is the variation in the gene sequence enough that the vaccine will not cover it. As of right now, there's still the thought process that we've yet to see that it's not, but we're early on in the concept, in the process of vaccinating. We need to continue to collect that information, and that is happening behind the scenes. But I do think that's an important point to make, because the question that everyone keeps asking us is, how do we achieve herd immunity? How do we achieve enough immunity to start removing the masks in places like school, at work, outside of the winter season? I think we might be stuck with masks for most winters from now on, but it's all early conversation. But Fredo, what do you think about this question of somebody asked, what does herd immunity look like in practice, knowing what we know about these variants and what we know so far?
Well, it just adds complexity to it. What are we herding against? If we're all vaccinated, against the strain from March 2020, we may not be, vaccinated or fully protected if we go to South Africa or Manaus. So this complicates herd immunity and understanding that it isn't also a foreign thing. Who knows what strains are circulating in your own community. So I think once the infections go down, and they will, I'm confident that they will. We know that in Israel, the infections have gone down dramatically. But, once you stop the bleeding, if you may, with less infections, you have less mutations. But not right now, it's open season for mutations. So I think we're not there yet. And hopefully in the next year or two, because again, if you have pockets of infection elsewhere, then there are mutations happening there too. And the world is, globalized and porous. So it's complicated. And I think we have to still do what we have been doing with regards to social distancing, et cetera. And frankly, doing what other places have been doing very, very well, like Taiwan, which is quarantining folks and doing those things, will be helpful. So in the future, if you travel and you may or may not be protected, but you still are more protected than not, and you do social distancing, et cetera, but also when you come back home, you quarantine, then things will look better overall.
Yeah, so I think to summarize that particular point is that we can need to continue with the current measures of social distancing, of hand hygiene, of masking, and things like that, and continue that until the infection rates go down. So that's number one, and continue with mass vaccination programs across the U.S. and hopefully help address hesitations as they come up, because that combination sounds like what could be leading us back to normalcy. Does that sound about right?
Exactly.
Yeah, so I'd love to go through the rest of your. I have another question that's relevant to this particular thought process. Somebody had asked, in the process of getting vaccinated, should PCR tests be done prior to receiving your vaccine so that you know if you're an asymptomatic virus carrier?
That is a great question. The short answer is no. It's not what we did in the studies for a variety of practical reasons. We know that a test can remain positive in your nose for a long time. So are you asymptomatically positive, or did you have an infection that you either barely realized or were asymptomatic a month or two ago? So the practical implications of that is that the test is somewhat difficult to interpret and unnecessary. So in an ideal world, sure, you would do that, and then you would wait that 10 or 14 days, and then you take it from there. But in reality, it's just not necessary or practical.
Great. I'll let you continue through the questions you have so far while we wait for more questions from our attendees. Please, guys, feel free to continue asking your questions as we move forward.
Yeah, and I think we've answered most of these with regards to resuming normal activities and travel and quarantining. The answer is, continue behaving as you have with regards to social distancing and masking and risk reduction. Now, one question that we haven't answered is, what if I get COVID-19? Well, going back to the slide over here, our study slide, you may be incubating COVID by the time that you get your first shot, or you may acquire it within those first 2 weeks. So, it is possible that you can get COVID-19 and that unfortunately the vaccine was too late. However, it's also possible that that you get it afterwards. And if that's the case, then you still get some protection. Now, if you get it before your second dose, then in general, you do have to wait. As I mentioned, you don't want to get the vaccine while actively infected necessarily. Where it falls between those 21 days will vary. You may have to delay it a little bit, not too much. But yeah, if you get it during the period between your first and second dose, then you may have to delay your second dose just a tad. But in general, you would still pursue the vaccination.
So I have a question that I think many people are going to start to think about, and that's, what if everyone in my family is vaccinated? Can we all gather together now?
That's a great question. And, you still have to be careful because of the variants. However, you can probably give yourself a little bit of space there too. And that is something that we are starting to loosen a little bit. If everybody around you is vaccinated, then that's you can potentially see yourself again. Try to keep your masks on, and keep it as safe as possible. It's a little bit nuanced. Did anybody travel? Are they doing the right things? So you can still sort of expand your bubble, but try to keep it as a bubble and understand that if everybody is vaccinated, then everybody's risk is much less.
Yeah, great. And the next question I want to ask is, the CDC recently had mentioned that if you are vaccinated and then exposed to somebody with COVID, that you no longer need to quarantine. What's sort of your response to that particular scenario? Because I think that that's going to happen quite a bit, and I think people want to kind of know how to feel and what to do after that situation.
Yeah, I think if you're vaccinated, I agree with the CDC, but we have to recognize that we're not talking about all quarantines. So not all quarantines are obviated. If you are exposed to a positive person, the first thing is you might you might be exposed to a positive person every day in your community and you don't even know about it. If the people around you are protected and you continue your mitigation efforts, then you're less likely to develop symptoms. And without the symptoms, it's less likely for you to give it to other people. Again, asymptomatic spread is a big problem. But when you're coughing, when you're febrile, you're more likely to give it to others. So there's some nuance there. We still have to keep quarantines for travel and for other types of exposures, but an exposure within your own community, that basically happens every day now, and has been happening every day for quite some time. But if you're vaccinated, you're just less likely to develop symptoms and give it to other people. These asymptomatic spreaders, by the way, they it's the pre-symptomatic spreaders that are the worst with regards to giving it to others. You're feeling fine, you hang out with a bunch of people, a day later, you have a fever. You were giving that virus at high amounts when you were feeling fine. These 30 or 40% of people that don't have symptoms whatsoever, they can still give it to folks, especially if they're unmasked. But the amount of virus there and the amount of travel that the virus does because you're not coughing is different. So that's where those things come.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. One of the questions that I see here is, will there ever be a time when we can expect life to go back to normal? And I hear the stress in that question because I think we're all feeling that. And normalcy, I think, will be very different from now on. And I think that that's the reality of the answer to that question. And I wish that we could give a different answer. And unfortunately, we're still learning so much about COVID, about its transmissibility, about the variants, and about the effectiveness of the vaccine in real life. And so I think the answer to that question is, I hope so. We are very optimistic in what we're seeing, and we hope that there will be some degree of normalcy of what it used to look like, but it will definitely be, it will have a different, normal will have a different appearance. Alfredo, do you want to make any comments to that question as well?
I think we're going to see some dramatic changes in the next couple of months. And I'll give you an example. Just vaccinating our folks in nursing homes and people in the first phases, older folks, means that our death rates are going to drop. Vaccinating more people means there's going to be less transmission. We are going to feel more comfortable. We are going to be able to live better. We're going to be able to go to restaurants without the concern that we've had, or be able to see our friends if they're vaccinated here and there. Life will become more normal. But what is normal? Normal is infections and pandemics, in the sense that it's a normal part of human history. And I'll give an example of a recent pandemic and global epidemic, which is HIV. Has life come back to normal since HIV? In general, people it has changed our sexual practices with regards to condoms and things like that. In the medical field, before HIV, in the 1970s and 60s, the routine use of gloves wasn't necessarily something that was in everybody's minds. So these pandemics are a part of existence and of being human, and interacting with our environment. And they come and go, but they always leave something behind. And as Dr. Zar said, Nahreen, for millions and millions of years, humans have always won. But what stays with us and how we adapt to it, I don't know what will stay. I suspect, once we get a fully, under control vaccine type of situation, then maybe we'll edge even further into what was previously normal. But a lot of things will stay as well. And we felt this dramatic pause of things, but we're also seeing a great acceleration of things where we are interacting more through Zoom and doing things differently, and shifting to e-commerce and all these other things. So I think the pandemic will have a significant impact in what the future normal will be.
Yeah, and I think the other point, and that's a beautiful response, Alfredo. And for those of you who may not know, Alfredo and I were residents together at the University of Illinois in Chicago, and Dr. Zar was our program director there. Lovely, lovely man who we think of very fondly, and so it's another reason why it's great to be with Alfredo on this particular webinar. But the one other comment I would really make here is that so many positives We're trying to turn some things into positives here, like focusing on mental health and things like that have really come up as something that have been a consequence of the pandemic, but also helping us to realize that we need to spend more time on our own mental health, on our families, and the things that really matter, and really trying to focus on what we can take away from this, what we can learn, and how we can move forward and be better. And I think the other question that I really want to bring up here is, oh gosh, I just forgot it. I'll have to come back to it for a second. I just forgot the question I was going to ask. Now I remember. It is understanding that we're still in a learning process, and a lot of this is happening dynamically. And I think the thing that people have brought up to me in the process of discussing that is, did we come up with the answers to or the solutions to COVID too quickly? So many people have mentioned, oh, the vaccine came around within a year. The reality is that a vaccine like this has been worked on for years and years and years. This technology has been around. Because this was a pandemic, all of the resources were pushed in one direction to get this rolling so that a vaccine with good efficacy could be released to the public to stop this pandemic from spreading even further. And I think that's a really important point, because that kind of circles back to the last question that that somebody had mentioned, which is, what is our advice to those who are reluctant or nervous to get the vaccine? And I know that that's been part of the hesitation as well. So Alfredo, I'll start with you as far as what your thoughts are on a response to that.
I think the basic response, and is looking at this graph, and understanding that, in the United States alone, hundreds of thousands of people, and worldwide, countless people have suffered, and that includes death. That includes, having continued chronic problems, so-called long haul COVID. So that the risk here is real, of not just getting real consequences from the virus, but your risk of acquiring it is extremely high. So having this tool is something that millions of people have not had. And I think we have to recognize that the access and the just the serendipity of being able to get vaccinated, that you've made it to the point where we have a vaccine. So that's the first thing. And the second thing is, having questions is important. Being hesitating about the vaccine is a sign that you have questions left unanswered. So you have to look for those questions and look for them in the right places, in the CDC and reputable expert websites, and your physician and other folks. So I would say I would rather be the line in the bottom than the line in the top. And understanding that you have questions is just an avenue to answer them, to make sure that this is the right thing for you.
Yeah. So, and then the other thought I would have as a response to that is, as of now, with the millions of people who have been vaccinated, and a lot of people who've hesitated, and I've looked through a lot of the survey responses, the main question or answer rather is, I'm waiting to see what happens. I'm waiting to see what happens when people get vaccinated. Guess what? A lot of people have been vaccinated. We have a lot of information about the safety profile of this vaccine now. And for those of you who are thinking, I want to wait it out, this is now your chance, because so many people have been vaccinated that the wait, I would say, is maybe over. Now the wait is just with vaccine distribution, which is unfortunately a whole nother conversation. But I think that's the hopeful part for those of you who are thinking, I want to see what happens. We are seeing what happens. We've seen a lot. We've seen millions of people vaccinated, and those that are in the vaccine game tend to say, I really, before I can say anything for sure about whether it's safe, I want to see at least 3 million doses in people's arms. We're well beyond that. And I think that's a really, really hopeful thing to keep in mind. And knowing that the safety profile is that, it's always about risk benefit. That's what life is, right? You weigh out the risk and benefit of every decision that you make. And COVID, we can tell you firsthand, working in an ICU, seeing sick patients with COVID, seeing some get better, seeing many die, and seeing those that get better live with the consequences of moderate to severe COVID illness. That's scary. That's a life that I would not wish that on anyone right now, because that's hard. That's a hard thing to walk away with, the amount of debility that people have after having such severe COVID. And if the risk is that high for that, then the benefit of the vaccine seems to outweigh the risk of getting COVID. And so I think that that's such an important point for those that are feeling reluctant. Keep the conversations going. There's nothing wrong with feeling hesitant. That is a completely normal and human response to this new thing that's happening. So keep the conversations going with with folks that are in healthcare that can answer your questions. Media has made it really challenging because we see so much misinformation. Go back to the CDC. The CDC is actually, and actually the Infectious Disease Society as well, has fantastic information, down to even, and I have it open right now, the CDC even has the federal pharmacy partners that are distributing the vaccine. Because the next question that people always ask us was, well, how do I get it? As the vaccine program expands and vaccination expands, more and more retail pharmacies will be offering it. So keep your eyes open. It does stink a little bit because you have to do some of the work to try and find where the vaccinations are in your local community. But keep looking, and hopefully that information will be more broadly available as time progresses. And the one thing I'll make as a comment on that is, we are seeing a lot of inequity, health inequity, healthcare access inequity with COVID, right? We saw that as populations of color and the native populations of the U.S. were hit especially hard. And I think to anybody that's in healthcare policy out there, we're doing our best to advocate that we bridge those gaps of health inequity. I'm currently in New Mexico working with Navajo Nation, and I have to say, just a shout out to New Mexico, that they've done an excellent job of vaccinating the Navajo people, recognizing that they're a high risk population, a vulnerable population who have really suffered a lot, and it's incredibly imperative that vulnerable populations are vaccinated. And so that's I do want to just make that plug for healthcare advocacy as well, because I think that's an important point to make as we move forward. Would love to see if there are any other questions. Let me take a look. I think that was it. Alfredo, were there any other comments that you wanted to make?
No, I think that covers it all.
Great. I just want to put this out there. If you guys, feel free to leave comments and things. We would love to be able to have a second go of this if there are more questions that come up. But obviously, feel free to reach out to us. We'd love to continue to answer your questions so you guys can be empowered to make the right decision for you. Thank you so much for listening. I guess we'll sign off here. Sorry, one last thing. I do want to mention MedGlobal is, as we talked about, an organization that does just so much across the globe. And we are really donation driven. We would love for you guys to check out our website, medglobal.org. If you are able, please donate. We really, all of the work that we do is really donation based, and any way that you can help is always amazing. So thank you so much, guys, for your time, and we wish you guys a safe week. Thanks.